Well, good evening. For those who don't know me, I'm Jane Bonglioni and I look after the Free Market Foundation's media relations. And tonight it is indeed a great pleasure to be able to introduce my colleague, Louw, the Free Market Foundation's Executive Director, an organisation which he co-founded 40 years ago. What to say about Louw? Well, there are so many things that one could say about him that I could be here all night, but then you wouldn't hear what he has to say, so I can't do that. Most of them are good, but not all, so ask me later over a glass of wine. Louw is a well-known media personality, speaker, debater, author, thinker, activist, political analyst. He's also a husband and father of 3 girls. He writes a weekly column for Business Day, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with on Wednesdays. Do look out for it. And not only is this column one of the longest running, it's been going for nearly 3 years, just over 3 years. It's also frequently the most read of all the columnists of Business Day, which is quite an accolade. Louw is driven by his passionate belief in liberty and freedom for all, and this has shaped his life story, some of which you'll hear. He's forthright, controversial, delights in demolishing myths and absurdities which we take for granted as fact. He calls it the tyranny of Twaddle. He takes a different view of what's happening in the world and South Africa, but always from a free market perspective, but one which is uniquely his own. Tonight he will talk about inequality and why it doesn't matter as much as the experts say it does. This in itself is a controversial statement and runs contrary to accepted correct positions of the chattering classes in the intelligentsia, which I'm sure you're familiar with. He has spoken and lectured in over 30 countries for some of the world's most prestigious organizations, and his advice is still being sought from many foreign governments. He's been instrumental in establishing many of South Africa's most respected institutions and NGOs. Earlier in his career, he was responsible for several key clauses in the formulation of the Constitution, especially the property rights clause, which is under such threat today, as we all know. One of his principal interests in life has been small and micro businesses and true black economic empowerment, and he is still active today in protecting and promoting the rights and interests of street traders in Johannesburg and elsewhere. Another passion is his belief in facilitating title deeds to the poorest of black families, and it was his commitment and drive that saw the establishment of the Free Market Foundation's Kyle land reform project, which helps tenants become home owners. Last Saturday, in a little-known ceremony in Sandton, his tireless and dedicated work for over 20 years in helping the people of Alexandra Township achieve their land claim and title success came to fruition in a historic signing with the Joburg City Council and the people of Alex. Louw is their hero, but not a lot of people know it. In what little spare time he has, Louw loves travel, nature, jogging. He recently did a cross-country half marathon with absolutely no training, so he said. He also loves music, especially Beethoven, and will shortly be featured on Classic FM's lovely Sunday evening program, which I'm sure many of you have listened to, People of Note with Richard Koch. Do you know it?
Yes.
This will be a musical journey of Louw's life with pieces chosen from his enormous collection of classical and other music, so do listen out for this. And now, may I give you Louw and a very engaging and thought-provoking talk.
Well, I think you have been prepared for the likelihood of me being controversial, and I make no apology for that. On the contrary, if you leave here saying you agreed with every word I said, then I think I will have failed you. I want you to rather maybe to go and say, I didn't agree with him, but he made me think. That will at least mean something. If you go away having agreed with everything I said, then your time and mine has obviously been wasted. Neither of us have gained anything, and we might as well not have been here. So I set myself the target and the challenge of challenging you and hopefully giving you some insights and information that might be new and thought-provoking. In return for me being free to be controversial, you need only note courtesies. You are absolutely free to disagree and to be rude. So that in turn gives me the license to be controversial. So let's do that, and I'm going to say some things which are perhaps sweeping generalizations, and I invite you during discussion and questions to ask me to elaborate, or if you really feel a burning desire for it as we go, then please interrupt right then and there, and if it becomes too much, we can decide to proceed. So I'm going to start with the so-called problem of inequality. UNICEF, United Nations Organization, said, for example, published, widely publicized around the world, that the richest 20% gets 83% of global income, with 1% for the poorest 20%, which really means the poorest 20 get 1% and the rich get essentially most of the world's income. That sounds amazing and extreme. In and of itself, it actually says nothing. It doesn't say that anyone who got a particular proportion of income did anything wrong. It supposedly has shock value, that there's something sort of inherently distressing about this without telling us what exactly it is that's distressing. But whether it's true is itself highly contentious, and we're going to explore that. UNICEF said it would take more than 800 years for the bottom billion to achieve 10% of global income. An interesting little switch of context here, which is quite important when one tries to understand the debate and the narrative, is switching away from percentages to billions. What exactly does that mean? And there's a reason for that, because it actually conceals more than it reveals, this kind of statement, as we will see. But do note that it will take 800 years, some of us will be long in the tooth by then, for this to happen, which implies that actually the bottom are gaining. In other words, the gap is narrowing, but slowly. In other words, the implication of UNICEF is the poor are getting a bigger proportion of income, but slowly. Now, this again goes itself against the prevailing narrative that the gap is growing and the poor are getting poorer and the rich are getting richer. Whether this has any real value is what we will see. Disturbing, they say, is the prevalence of children among the poorest. Approximately 50% are below the $2 a day poverty line. Well, this is quite interesting in and of itself. Children aren't meant to be working, so it is interesting that child labor is earning so little, and apparently UNICEF doesn't mind the fact that there's child labor, but is distressed about how little the children earn. Now, one of the interesting statistical anomalies is that the people in the top income groups are simply older people, and in the bottom group younger people, and something like 70% of the people in the bottom 20 move into the top 20 over their lifetime. So that's one of the trickeries that you will see as we go, is that there's a cheating and lying about who is the poor and who are the poor and who are the rich, as if they are a fixed group. Sort of the poor are always the same people. They're not. They're a shifting group of people, essentially defined by age, and they are distressed about the fact that children earn so little. It's surprising that they earn anything. That doesn't seem to bother them. This is the Guardian's view of the problem. Occupy Wall Street, according to their journalist, eminent, internationally recognized journalist Andrew Hussey, is that capitalism has failed the world, and Thomas Piketty, who you've all heard about, Capital in the 21st Century, which I'm going to have much to say about later, explains why they're right, that capitalism has failed the world. The word capitalism is one of the many words in this narrative that is seldom defined, and we'll see how important that can be if you just do not define your terms. So we don't, and I'm going to give you a lot more. Words like wealth, like income, like capital, are seldom defined, and often deliberately, because an attempt to define them would lead to exposing the flaws in some of this narrative. And why this narrative exists is what we have to go into. Why is it that people want to create an impression that there's growing inequality and increasing poverty, when in fact the objective data and the statistics tell us quite the opposite? And I'm going to go into that. Why do they want this distortion or falsification? And it's quite extreme, and I make no apology for saying it's completely reprehensible and immoral, as we will see. Capitalism has failed, they say, The Guardian and many others, yet in freer markets. Now, capitalism and freer markets might not be the same thing. We call ourselves the Free Market Foundation. Avoid the word capitalism because it's ambiguous. Apartheid was supposedly capitalism. Nazism is supposedly capitalism. They're clearly not free markets, so nobody could say that apartheid was a free market. But so the word capitalism is ambiguous, and probably that's why it's used, because you can get it to mean anything you want. So it slithers and slides around meaning different things. They call now Putin's Russia capitalist. Is it or isn't it? Communist China is now called capitalist. So these words slither and slide around. And it's often deliberate. So capitalism has failed, yet in freer markets, this is where the poor migrate. The poor of the world move only and always in one direction, from less free to more free markets. So if free markets and capitalism have failed the poor, why is that where they want to go? Why is that where they always risk and often lose their lives trying to get to? People try and escape from Cuba to America, never from America to Cuba. They try to escape from East Germany to West Germany, never West Germany to East Germany. The poor try to flee from North to South Korea, never South to North Korea. There is always a migration of the poor. They seem to know something the intellectuals do not know. That the best place to be poor is where there are lots of rich people. That is where you want to be the poor person. And that is, in fact, the poor of the world know that very, very well, and they never move in the other direction. That is the tendency of migration. The boat people getting across the Mediterranean are going from the less free to the more free economies, from the places where there are less rich people to the places where there are more rich people, from where there are fewer billionaires to where there are more billionaires. The poor want to be where the billionaires are, and yet we are told they resent them and hate them and don't like them. And where the poor have the highest living standards, that is in freer markets, and where the poor get most infrastructure and welfare in the freer markets, despite them supposedly not being welfare states. That is where there is most welfare, where there are most handouts, where there are most minimum wage laws, where there are most healthcare, government housing, etc., is actually in the freer economies, in the capitalist economies. That is why the poor want to go there. And where there is, and the freer economies produce essentially all of the world's technology and innovation. The technology around you, the lighting, the cell phone you have, the vehicle that brought you here, almost every little component, millions and millions of patents and trademarks that enable you to have the lifestyle you have right now, that comes almost pretty much 100% of it from the freer so-called capitalistic economies. That is where that is all invented and developed, and that is what the poor know and want. And they have zero poverty, and we're going to define poverty. Poverty is defined by the United Nations as less than $1 a day, inflation adjusted, and because poverty became virtually eliminated, they redefined it as $2 a day, 100% increase, in order to be able to continue to say there's poverty. And what's more, in the freer economies, as an objective statistical fact, the number of people earning less than $2 a day, or the equivalent, is essentially zero. So there is no poverty at all in these countries, as defined by the United Nations. Itself an interesting objective fact, which we'll also cover more in detail. People who are concerned about poverty and inequality in the prevailing narrative, they supposedly care about the poor. They know that inequality is increasing. They somehow know it. It is said to be increasing. But where's the actual data? Where are statistics? What are the objective facts? They know that they know what inequality is. This word inequality is used as if it has some sort of objective meaning. There is inequality. What exactly do you mean? Do you mean some people are healthier? Do you mean some people have more wealth? a retired person might have lots of wealth but no income? Or do you mean people don't have the same income, or they don't have the same housing? Or what does it mean to be unequal? So there's supposedly an objective definition somewhere. And they know that poverty is increasing by whatever they mean by the word poverty. You are almost never told, not even in 800-page textbooks, do they actually tell you what these terms mean. And they sometimes do, so I don't want to make absolute, but we'll get into that. And they know what poverty is, what exactly does it mean to say someone is poor. You all are familiar with such terms as grinding poverty, absolute poverty, destitution, indigence, and so on. And the reason for these definitions is because of the what that was, some sort of cell phone connection. Bubblegum is an Android operating system. I don't know what that's doing there, but anyway. They know what poverty is, and they know that poverty and inequality are a problem. It's just a problem. Whose problem is it? And why is it a problem? And for whom is it a problem? But it's just a problem. The problem of poverty and inequality gets trotted out as a meme, as a cliche, as a platitude that supposedly has some objective content. And does it indeed have that? And they know that it's unfair. That it's somehow, there's something unfair about this, if it's true at all. And they want more self-serving power to solve the problem. In there, I think, lies the explanation for the obsession with this issue, is that it's people who themselves intend to benefit by having it declared a problem. They will then get more power, and they will get more status, and they will get more influence, and actually more income. And then you have this terrible triplets: poverty, inequality, and unemployment, as if they are part of the same thing. Solving one might require increasing or aggravating the other. They are different concepts, and they roll together as if solving one somehow solves the other two. And in fact, solving one might aggravate the other two. That is one of the issues in the narrative. The reality, on the other hand, is that people concerned about poverty and inequality are obsessed with wealth, not poverty. And this is quite important. All of the literature, Thomas Piketty's 700 pages of supposed data and statistics, is about rich people. Wall Street is about, Occupy Wall Street, the 1% issue, is about rich people. All you ever hear about is obsession about rich people and how supposedly bad they are. Never a word about whether the living standards of the poor are rising, or where they are rising, or why they are rising. Nothing about the poor. You read Thomas Piketty's book, and I went through this thinking sooner or later there's going to be something about the poor, about their welfare services, or their housing, or their education, or their transport, or whatever it might be, their life expectancy. Nothing. It's as if the poor don't exist. So interestingly, these people have created some kind of impression that they care about the poor, actually ignore the poor. It's as if the poor don't exist, as if there aren't any poor people. All they're obsessed about is some people are rich and that's a bad thing. They have to somehow, for some reason that's bad, and whoever these rich people are have to be pulled down. And they are denialists, I call them wealth denialists, about why and where the poor rise from destitution by the million. Now, as it happens, never before in history has poverty been eliminated and alleviated on the scale that has happened in the last 25 to 30 years. It has been spectacular. Those of us with grey hair, and there are far too many in this room, I'm sad to say, can remember when the average TV program, or even before that, the average movie tone in the movies, where it's your source of visible news, or newspapers, were reporting on starvation in Bangladesh, and Ethiopia, and Eritrea, and so on, and Chad, and what have you. It was genuinely starving people by the thousand or by the million, dying of starvation. That was the news 25, 30 years ago. When last was there a news broadcast about someone actually starving? Starvation as such has essentially disappeared. It is rumored still to exist in North Korea, but there is no hard evidence for that. So the astonishing rise from destitution, from grinding poverty of humanity, is ignored. Nobody says, where did it happen? In China, India, Bangladesh? Why did it happen? Africa has the world's highest regional economic growth rate. Poverty and destitution are being alleviated at an astonishing scale. Literacy is rising, life expectancy is rising. There is no interest in that fact, why it's happening, where it's happening, what explains it, and what can be learned from it to extend it to the people who have not joined in that astonishing revolution. And they are denialists about the decline of inequality. Now, inequality has declined again spectacularly, and I'm going to explain that too. They want to pull down the rich at the expense of the poor. They are typically themselves rich. They tend to be almost all of the people who generate this narrative in the top 1%, or certainly in the top 5%, and yet they speak presumptively for the poor, as if they represent the poor, without ever telling us who these people are, who are this problem and who they represent, and without ever saying where the poor have got better conditions, how did that happen and why, and what can we learn from it, and how can we emulate and replicate it around the world. They never say what's unfair about this wealth. Who was unfair to who? If Raymond Ackerman happens to be wealthy and Leon Louw happens to be poor, has Raymond Ackerman been unfair to Leon Louw? There's never a discussion about this. And as the philosopher Friedrich Hayek said, is if all individual transactions are fair, I offer to sell you this for 10 rand and you buy it, nobody observing will say that there's been unfairness. And if in the process you or I become very, very wealthy, as a result of lots of transactions, that each one of which is fair, how can you call the outcome unfair? Or if Bill Gates sells us software programs like the one being used here and becomes one of the world's wealthiest people, has he done anything unfair to anybody? Has Christo Wiese, who's supposedly South Africa's wealthiest person, opened shops selling clothes to the poor? To whom was he unfair? But somehow being rich is unfair, although nobody did anything unfair to become rich. Or at least if they did, that's not alleged. The literature doesn't say, they say the outcome is unfair, but they never say the process was unfair. Now that seems to be an almost impossible thing to justify. Truly concerned people, in which I include myself, celebrate. On the contrary, we, instead of lamenting and getting distressed about the state of wealth and poverty in the world, we celebrate humanity's greatest accomplishment. We are living at the greatest moment in human history with the virtual elimination of destitution on the planet. This is an extraordinary accomplishment. Human beings have never been as well off as they are now, and there's huge amounts of literature and data to point that out. Life expectancy of the rich since biblical times was about 70 years. That has nudged up since biblical times by 5 years or so. The rich still live 10 and a little bit extra for healthcare. The poor, who used to have a life expectancy of 20 or 30 years, now have a life expectancy of 65 years. In other words, they're catching up. The poor are living nearly as long as the rich, and at the current rate there will be no difference in life expectancy between the rich and the poor in about 15 years. So the elimination of destitution and the rising living standards and quality of life of the world's poor billions is something to celebrate and to emulate for those people who have been left behind. That's really what we have to say. How has this been achieved? Billions of human beings. Virtually everyone in China and India and Asia and Africa included now, South America, rising out of destitution. We celebrate the fact that free markets outperform dirigism or unfree markets, always and everywhere. Just a huge outperformance of freer markets. In other words, freedom. Where people are free, things are better. It's really that simple. And the invisible hand of freedom versus the visible foot of power. We celebrate the absence of power and the presence of freedom, which brings not only the dignity of freedom, and freedom as an end in itself, but the world's best living standards. So the two happen to coincide, fortunately. The pro-market evidence which eliminates informed debate. You cannot actually have an informed debate anymore about this issue. The evidence is completely overwhelming as evidence gets, or as conclusive as evidence ever gets in social science. It is no longer subject to informed debate. You can't have a good faith debate anymore about the objective data. And the quality of life and technology and welfare we celebrate. Now let me just explain that a little. When I was a kid, our domestic worker was from Malawi. And the only way he could communicate with his family in Malawi was to ask us, the children who went to school, to write a letter to his family in Malawi. And we would have to write what he wanted. Now, obviously, in writing to his family, he couldn't say anything too intimate or personal that he wouldn't want children writing the letter for him to know. My parents would then put this in an envelope, put a stamp on it, and send it to Malawi, and it might arrive 2 or 3 weeks later, at which end there would be a post restante, which young people don't even know what the word means. But his family would have to get themselves to a post office, ask if there was anything for them. They would search through it, and if they were lucky, they would get it. Then they would have to go and find somebody who could read them the letter. Then they would have to find somebody, also probably a kid at school, who could write a letter back. They would have to then get it to a post office. It would arrive probably a month, 2 or 3 months later. That was how people in the lower income groups used to communicate with each other. Now there are as many cell phones, active cell phones in the world nearly as there are people. Now the Maasai herdsmen, which I've seen I'm married to a Kenyan, and we visited Kenya a lot, where I see the Maasai herdsmen, so-called, walking around with the iconic cell phone in one hand, the assegai in one hand, keeping the lions away from their goats. And what's more, they no longer carry money. In Kenya, and increasingly elsewhere, money is now in your cell phone. So now, the poorest people in the world can teleconference at virtually no cost with Skype or with WhatsApp with their friends and relatives anywhere else on the planet, virtually free, and virtually everyone who wants to has now access to that technology. That's just communication, has had that equalizing effect. Whereas when I was a kid, only rich people had a party line where you would crank a handle and you would get somebody who would plug things into a board and would listen to you and say, "Jy praat kak," for example. Many of you obviously understand Afrikaans, so sorry, I thought this was an English audience. But nonetheless, that is literally an experience I once had. So yes, and so that is just with telecommunications. Now healthcare, the poor never had access to painkillers. Our domestic worker, Gladys Nkosi, had a hip replacement at about the same time as my wife Frances. She had hers in the Morningside Clinic. Gladys had hers in the Johannesburg General Hospital. She paid 50 Rand, my wife paid 50,000 Rand, or maybe Discovery did, I'm not sure. But nonetheless, the poor and the rich now have access to technology that didn't exist a decade ago. That is astounding and available increasingly to all human beings on the planet. So it goes. You could look at motorized transport. Our housekeeper used to walk or ride a bicycle. Once in every 2 or 3 years, he would be taken by my father to a train and go back to his family in Malawi. Now virtually everyone can use and does use motorized transport. Electricity, running water, and so on and so forth. So just think of what technology alone has done to equality amongst the rich and the poor. And this is presumed somehow just wished away as if it doesn't happen. So this is, in my view, what the inequality junkies feel about the poor. They actually are not interested in the poor. They never talk about the poor. They never show they never reflect the fact that the poor are better off. And they ignore the poor. The poor to them are irrelevant. They're obsessed with the rich and with wealth. To the extent they could care about wealth, they would prefer, they don't like unequal wealth, instead they prefer equal destitution and poverty. They want people to be equal, even if they are all poor. Now let me give you a simple example. If you have 100 poor people, and 5 people become wealthy, but the remaining 95 are no worse off, is that good or bad? You have then from equality, you get inequality. Is that inequality bad? Well, some people, including me, would say, no, it's good. I want to see some people get better off, as long as no one gets worse off. But to the inequality junkies, apparently what they prefer is for everyone simply to stay poor, if that's the choice. And so, now let's get to Thomas Piketty. He is the rock star of inequality. He's written the world's most popular, one of the most popular books, one of the biggest selling books. He is himself in the 1%, he's exceedingly wealthy and exceedingly successful. And what's more, I don't know if any of you know this, but there's a statistical exercise that works out which are the least read books in the world, which books get bought the most but not read. And this is worked out by using Kindle and Amazon and other sources. And the statistical exercise shows that this is the book in the world, Piketty's book, which everyone quotes and everyone refers to, but nobody reads. Which is the book that is the least read. In other words, in fact, the average buyer of the book gets to page 26 out of 700 pages. So this is the book fewest people in the world actually read, and it's the most expensive doorstop in the world. But nonetheless, let's look at what's in it, because it is very profoundly influential. It's having a huge impact on the world. Thomas Piketty says wealth and income are distributed, as opposed to earned, exchanged, saved, invested, produced. It's as if there is wealth somewhere, and you get some, and you get some, and you get some. That's what distribution of wealth would mean. In other words, the wealth pre-exists. That is, of course, not how wealth works. Wealth is generated, produced, made. The clothes you're wearing weren't simply somewhere and then distributed, of which you got the ones you have, and I didn't, which is unfair. No, the clothes you're wearing were produced, and somebody sold them and transported them. And so, according to Piketty, and literally that is so, and you can read, if you doubt it, some of you might have tried to read Piketty. It's very improbable that any of you finished, but if you did, this is one of the most influential books of all time, and this is how he sees wealth. He sees, to him, wealth is just there. He doesn't discuss how it comes to be comes into existence. And then capital performs no function. As far as he's concerned, if you tax capital, you take capital away from people who have it and put it in the hands of the state, which then uses it to pay pensions and welfare grants and things. But there's no consequence to that. He doesn't think capital is an important thing in the world, that capital produces technology and wealth and exchange and jobs and so on. So capital, as far as he is concerned, and the people who support this narrative are concerned, people who have capital just get wealthier because they have capital. That the capital doesn't actually do anything. It's not actually generating any benefits other than yielding dividends to the people who happen to have it. And that again, you might not believe me. I don't blame you actually for thinking I'm exaggerating. I expect you to think I'm oversimplifying or exaggerating. But no. If you want chapter and verse, either look at the book yourself or I will give it to you. But this is in fact the book. This is in fact the Bible of inequality junkiedom. Billions arising from destitution, he regards this as irrelevant, doesn't mention it, completely as if it doesn't happen. So he doesn't care about the world's population at all. He cares about a few people with capital. Wealth is personally, the definition of wealth, according to Piketty, is that which is personally owned, dividend-yielding capital. Now, just think about that for the time being. It's when you own shares on the JSE, you have wealth or capital. But your fridge, your microwave, your car, your house, your holiday home, your jewelry, your education, your access to hospitals, medical care, your access to electricity and water and infrastructure and police protection. None of this, according to him, is wealth. And for example, if you are the wife and children of Bill Gates, according to him, you are impoverished. You have zero wealth. Because people who do not actually personally, in their own name, own shares are not considered to have capital. That is, the definition of capital is personally owned, dividend-yielding shares, essentially. So you can have a fabulous income, you can have a fabulous lifestyle, you can be as fabulous as all of you are in this room, but according to him you are poor unless you own dividend-yielding shares. And then what the rest have isn't wealth. What everyone else has is not wealth, including, by the way, government. So Eskom, according to him, is not wealth, because it's not a dividend-yielding asset in the name of a person. So Eskom and SABC and SA Airways and the roads and the beaches and the game reserves and all of this and the water reticulation system and this is not wealth. This is you just pretend it doesn't exist and doesn't have any value. Now that is how you get these strange numbers that you saw of how much is owned by how few, because you just define away what the masses own as if it doesn't exist. And celebrities, interestingly, are miraculously exempt. So if you Oprah Winfrey, or if you Tiger Woods, or if you Dolly Parton, or I don't know, Herbert von Karajan, and you exceedingly, stinkingly, horribly multi-billionaire, dollar-billionaire wealthy, one of the wealthiest people on earth, you're exempt. They are not considered bad or evil or unfair. That's okay. In fact, they're heroes. In fact, they demonstrate at Wall Street against people who are much, much poorer but own shares, which is one of the strange paradoxes and ironies. And it's just a sort of recycled, weird Marxist mythology. Now, the end of poverty is a relative term, firstly understand. So according to a billionaire, a millionaire is poor. That's why the word is actually very unhelpful. You have to consider relative wealth versus absolute wealth. In other words, that is why we add words like real or grinding or absolute poverty, or better words are destitution and indigence. These really capture what we should be concerned about. We shouldn't be concerned about inequality, we should be concerned about the quality of life of the so-called masses of ordinary human beings. That is what I think a decent human being would worry about. In the 1980s, poverty was defined as earning less or living off less than $1 a day or its equivalent. Inflation brings up that to about $1.40, and 30% of humanity then, in the time of Jimmy Carter, when this was done, was called poor, was defined objectively by the United Nations as poor. By that definition, it is now less than 10%, and if you add the stuff I was talking about, technology and welfare and access to infrastructure and so on, it's less than 5%, and some people argue even less than 3%. So by that definition, since the 1980s, in little more than one generation, poverty as defined has disappeared almost completely. That doesn't mean that I'm not concerned about the street traders and the people in Alex and the people in the Winterveld with whom we work in the Free Market Foundation and for whom we're trying to get title deeds. And we took the Joburg City Council to the Constitutional Court when it cleared 3,000 street traders off the streets, by literally the cleansing department. The people who clean litter in Joburg were mandated to clear people off the streets as if they were litter. We brought a constitutional challenge and the council was forced to let them back onto the streets. Those are the people we're concerned about, but we celebrate the fact that their living standards are rising. That is wonderful and we work for it, and we would like them to rise much more. That doesn't stop us from observing that by objective definitions, poverty has virtually disappeared as defined by the United Nations. We would like to see more and more high living standard people in the world. Any normal, decent human being wants that. This isn't a moral issue. You're some kind of pervert if you don't want that. Everyone wants everyone to be well off. The question is, how do you get there and how much progress is being made? And it is actually quite impressive. So having been eliminated, they redefined, it's now called $2 a day. And when everyone's got $2 a day, they'll call it $3 a day, or $4 a day. They'll just keep changing the definition. $1 buys now much, much more than it did then. In other words, even if you didn't have an increase in the number of dollars people have, you would have a huge increase in the living standards people have. Massive, massive increase. Same number of dollars would give you fantastically better living standards. So by all objective measures, welfare has risen dramatically. So there is what I call wealth denialism in the world. The rich happen to be denying the fact that the poor are gaining wealth very impressively. So how do you define inequality? What does it mean to be unequal? There's the famous Gini coefficient, which I'm going to say something about. There's formal and informal sector. So what about the informal sector, the street vendors with whom we work? Welfare is an indirect or direct phenomenon. Welfare, does that have anything to do with wealth? Having access to hospitals and medicines and painkillers and what have you, and antibiotics. And what about dependents? People who will depend on government, people who receive welfare, whether it's in a family, my children, or whether it's people in a shanty town who get medical care. These people, do they have inequality? Or does Gladys, our housekeeper, have equality with healthcare with my wife Frances? They both have the same hip replacement at the same time, and it's the same technology, but we wouldn't call them equal. Or would we? Maybe we should. That's the uncertainty. Wealth refers to assets, personally held assets as opposed to living standards. And endowments, what about physical? What about mental characteristics? Being old and stupid and sickly and crotchety and ugly versus being young and gorgeous and intelligent and successful and athletic and healthy. How do you make those two people equal? What would you do to make them equal? Would they be equal if they all had the same income and the same assets? Or would you have to compensate for the person who's old and sickly and ugly and stupid? How do you make two human beings equal? It is actually not possible. Theoretically, it's not possible. Conceptually, it's not possible. And to talk about just hard few rands is a completely meaningless way of thinking about equality of human beings. You could think of equal rights under law and equal opportunities. That would be a definition of equality, as we have in South Africa in our constitution. Everyone is equal at law. That's an objective definition of equality, but the consequences of that are not equal incomes or ages or health or education levels or happiness levels or whatever it might be. Luck, culture, genes and health play an important role. How would you make them equal? Can you tell me under what conditions these two people would be considered equal? It is clearly impossible. There is no definition of equality which has any coherence or meaning in the context of people.
If he shaved, he might look more equal.
And what about them? You know, do you concern? They swim by the same rules in the same race, but the outcome is going to differ. Which one is going to win, I'm not sure, because probably when the big one dives in, he'll clop the little one.
There'll be no water and you'll walk.
Apples and oranges, you know, what makes them equal? How do you make two different people or communities or societies or cultures or religions equal? If, for example, Islam doesn't allow for interest on savings and loans, can they be considered equal to Protestants who do? Well, under what conditions would they be equal? And the answer is it's not definable. One of the popular definitions is Gini coefficient, and it's strange that it's popular because it's an economic term that has almost no meaning. It's a weird kind of concept of equality. Economists have a very specific meaning in mind, actual income earned. Nowhere in economic or econometric science does it say people with the same Gini coefficient are equal. It's speaking about specifically incomes, earned incomes, and it's not even talking about after-tax incomes. So it's a very narrowly defined concept with very, very little use. But nonetheless, it's always trotted out as if it has some kind of meaning and everyone knows what it means. wealth and income are not distributed. As I say, what you can say is distributed is IQ or eye color. There's a distribution of eye color, a distribution of height, hair color, etc. But there is no distribution of income. Income is earned. And income and wealth can be acquired, earned, generated, plundered, taxed, redistributed, destroyed, or eroded. This is a Gini coefficient. For what it's worth, what it really says is that over there, one person owns everything, and over there, everyone is precisely equal. That would be the meaning in terms of the Gini coefficient in earned income. That's all it's talking about. Not living standards, not wealth, not assets, not how many TV sets and cars and how much jewelry and how old or young or what medical care you have, whether you live in a rich or a poor country. It's just talking about income in dollar terms. So it's a very narrow. But these are the Gini coefficients since World War II. And it looks as if there's a huge inequality, doesn't it? Some countries are highly equal, some are highly unequal. South Africa is sort of roughly there. And this is if you ever see a graph, this is what you will see. If you see a graph, they'll tell you there's a great Gini inequality, and if you see anything, they show you this. But it's a fraud. Why is it a fraud? Because they take the top and the bottom off. If you put the top and the bottom on, that's in fact what you see. All of the countries of the world are roughly the same, and the differences between the top and the bottom are actually quite small. And apart from those two outliers, Brazil and Mexico, pretty much all countries in the world are there in a band of about 20%. And so the Gini coefficient is itself presented as if it tells you a lot, but it actually tells you almost nothing, even in the narrow thing it's trying to address. This is a more relevant thing. By the Gini coefficient, inequality here, and economic freedom there, you can see there's a pretty random scatter chart. It's a very low, statistically relevant correlation, but to the extent there's any at all, this is the trend line. Freer, more capitalistic, more free market economies have more equality than less free equality countries. This is what tells you. So if you want more equality, firstly, changing the economic system doesn't produce much of a difference. It's a pretty small variable. But to the extent if you want it at all, then what you have to do is have a freer economy, paradoxically. In other words, less socialist. In other words, where the government redistributes, people become more unequal, strangely and paradoxically enough. As the Nobel economist Friedrich Hayek said, the government can do more for the people by doing less. I was a nominee for the Nobel Prize, but I didn't get it, and the reason is I didn't put it as eloquently as him, because I said when things are in the hands of the state, they're in a hell of a state. This here is the share of the top 10%. Again, you can see it's not very big, doesn't make much of a difference, but you can see to the extent there's more economic freedom, there's slightly less in the hands of the top 10%. It's a small difference. And this is the bottom 20%. You can see again it actually makes no difference. So the economic system makes almost no difference. So when people argue about socialism versus capitalism, it actually has very little to do with the outcome. Now we hear about the income gap, and I want to talk about the income gap mythology. The rich get richer, the poor supposedly get poorer, but in fact what happens is the rich get richer and the poor get richer faster. And this is why the gap appears to be a gap at all. Imagine poor people starting with $10, rich people starting with $1,000. That's roughly the ratio between the richest and poorest groups. Top deciles, as they call, top and bottom 10% or so, is roughly 100-fold. And what happens is, let's assume the poor get richer at 20% over whatever period, an absolute number over a year, doesn't matter what, over time. And the rich get richer at half the rate. So the poor are getting poorer at double the rate that the rich are getting richer. What will happen to the gap? The gap which started there will grow and grow and grow, and the gap will go, even though the poor are getting rich at twice the rate of the rich, the income gap will grow. The only way to prevent the income gap growing is actually to stay poor. If you get richer in a country, the gap grows. Simple arithmetic, standard 2 arithmetic actually. If you add a small percentage of a big amount, or a big percentage of a small amount, the small percentage of the big amount is more than the big percentage of a small amount. It's really that simple. We all learned that in Standard 2, and yet the world's leading econometricians don't seem to know it. So this is exactly how it works. Now, how fast would the rich, the poor have to grow to keep up with the rich? If the rate of growth of the poor is 10%, 20%, only 1,000%. If the rich are growing at 5%, the poor would have to grow at 1,000% for the gap to stay the same. Not narrow, stay the same. So you can see that wanting the gap to not grow means actually not wanting the economy or the country to grow. You cannot become a richer country without having a bigger gap. That is what you have to accept as a necessary consequence. Then everyone ignores the socio-psychology of it all. The fact that there's a gap motivates people. Why would you bother to do anything if you can't lift yourself up more from where you are? In other words, create a gap between where you were and where you want to be. That means there's a gap between you and someone who didn't do that. So the only thing that will motivate you ever to do anything is the belief that you can increase the gap. Either your personal gap or your gap with other people who don't do what you do. That is the necessary. If you cannot improve your condition by effort and ingenuity and thrift and saving and staying healthy and avoiding sugar and salt and tobacco and all the things Minister Motsoaledi wants us to do, then you wouldn't bother, you see. The only reason you bother is because you can make yourself better off. Eusebius McKaiser, a well-known journalist, is of the view that unequal prosperity is worse than equal poverty. Now, I know that because he said it on various occasions, but he said it when I was on his radio program. He said, I am wrong to want poor people to become richer if all poor people don't become richer at the same rate. In other words, he said, it doesn't matter if no one's worse off. You just don't ever want people to be unequal. And then when I said, but why then would people bother to do anything? And he didn't really have an explanation. Because they're just nice. Because this is how people should be. We should just, I don't know, work like ants in an ant-heap or bees in a beehive. Just work for the cause. So why is it that people are so obsessed with equality? I think it's a kind of crude Darwinism. In other words, what concerns some people is not where you are in absolute terms, well off, with food and nice clothing and transport, but where you are in relative terms, the pecking order. Now that does seem to concern many people more than... So in other words, whereas people like us are concerned about lifting the poor, regardless of what happens to the rich, just don't care a darn about the rich. Other people are concerned about, no, we don't want the rich to be rich. That's just wrong. And, well, that's, I guess, some kind of value system. I don't know what it is, but that's how they are. So, do the rich get resented by the poor? Well, this is an assumption that the Piketty and others say that the inequality causes conflict and destabilization and resentment, and I keep saying, where's the evidence? Did someone do a survey? And trust me, no one has. It is just said to be true. By who? Why? On the contrary, yeah.
Joseph Stiglitz says that over the past 4 decades, the average working American has become worse off than he was 40 years ago.
Yeah. Stiglitz.
What's your opinion on that statement?
Yes, that's not what he says. What he says is quite important, and you've got to unpack all of the detail. He says middle-class households. Now, when you talk about household income, you must immediately become suspicious and say, why are they not talking about individual or per capita income? And the reason is, as people become richer, households get smaller. They have fewer children, and the relatives move out, and they get their own apartments and their own houses and so on. So if you use as your criterion household income, then although the households are getting smaller and have less income, precisely because the people are getting richer. And that's actually, if you want to know the answer to Stiglitz, you read Thomas Sowell, who's my favorite thinker in the world at the moment. He's my guru, let's say. And for those who don't know of Thomas Sowell, he doesn't want anyone to know this, but I'm going to say it anyway. He happens to be a black American, and he's, I think, one of the greatest intellects of all time. And when he was on the Oprah Winfrey show, she said, "I'm surprised to hear a black man with a view like yours," and he said, "I'm not a professional black man, and I never use my skin when I think." So I think that is, so he has gone into that and exposed the myth. And it's, you know, whether it's malicious or in good faith, I don't know. I don't know. Do people who use these numbers know that what they're doing is actually misleading us? Is that deliberate? Or is it just they look at household income and see that household incomes are falling? And they think that's bad, but they don't actually look at the number of people in the household and the age of the people in the household, and so on and so forth. And income versus wealth is another issue they avoid. Like, the household might earn less because the people are older and more people are retired. So they're not earning an income and living off savings or pensions and so on. There's lots of mythology.
He also makes the point that people are having to get involved in more than one job just to keep their sort of standard of living sort of reasonable.
Well, that again is, let me just say, a fraud. The so-called making ends meet, and they often have pictures of people sitting around their swimming pool discussing how they're battling to make ends meet. And the answer is no, their living standards have risen spectacularly. The number of TV sets, the square meters of housing, the amount of clothing, the life expectancy, by every objective statistic. That is simply wrong. So when they say people are battling to make ends meet, well, I'm sure Bill Gates battles to make ends meet because he has to buy himself a new jumbo, you know, I don't know, a new Airbus or something. I suppose there's something he buys that's difficult to buy. I wouldn't know at that level. But, you know, compared to, well, let's just test this thing of the poor resenting the rich. In this room, there are some people like me who are poor and some people like Robert who are rich. Now, Robert will be relieved to know that I'm not angry with him, I don't resent him, and I don't think he's been unfair. Okay, so this idea of the poor resent, where do you resent people who are richer than you? Are you angry? Are you feeling revolutionary? You want to rise up against them? Is that the feeling you get when you're dealing with waiters in restaurants, or when you're dealing with the mechanic, or whatever? This thing of this idea that people hate and resent each other. Jane came with me to Alex when we had a community meeting over there, and she and I were the only Mlungus, and we walked in, and what did we find? You couldn't have had more warmth, more non-racial, non-class, non-sex, non-anything. She herself said, how many people know that this is the real world? This is how ordinary human beings are. Okay, let me move on because I'm going to run out of time. We can get back to questions later. Celebrities, as I say, are exempt, but just quickly, the issue of whether the poor resent the rich. They watch soap operas. They love celebrities. They you know, do they resent CEOs, what CEOs earn? Who cares? As long as their living standards are rising. In fact, sometimes the workers actually own in South Africa more on the stock exchange than anyone else through the Public Investment Corporation. The PIC is the biggest single investor on the stock exchange. And that belongs to the workers, civil servants, are the owners. They are the biggest investors on the stock exchange. They could go to all the meetings of the listed companies, vote out the CEOs, vote. I mean, I'm happy to be the CEO at a fraction of the price of Sizwe and Kasama, for example. But why don't they vote me in? Because they want him. They think he, a multi-millionaire, is going to actually be better for their own investment than Leon Louw. You see, so I think they're wrong, but nonetheless. So to summarize, let's get to the end. The terrible triplets, poverty, unemployment and inequality, are never defined, and they have no connection. They're just unrelated concepts, and they're concepts you can't even intellectually conceptualize. In other words, there is no, you cannot think of what equality means. It's a word with virtually no coherent meaning unless you contextualize it, unless you mean equality of life expectancy, or equality of physical health, or equality of rights, or equality of literacy, or equality of something. You've got to say what you mean by this term equality. Equality of looks. You know, I don't look as good as Jane, for example. It's just bad luck for me. There's nothing I can do about it. Now, how do you make us equal? Well, you could do cosmetic surgery on her to make her ugly. And so inequality is undefinable and inevitable. You cannot stop it. There's nothing you can do about it. And it's motivational, and wealth doesn't cause poverty. They object to people being rich as if somehow that made other people poor. It doesn't. And on the contrary, where people are rich, fewer people are poor. And inequalities junkies simply do not care about the poor. And I want to repeat that. I want to stress it. Listen to them. They never discuss the poor. They don't visit the poor. They don't know how they live. They don't go into their communities. They don't lobby for them. They're not activists for them. They have no interest in the poor. They are obsessed with not just the rich, because they are rich. They're obsessed with other people who are rich, namely people who are rich because they save money and formed capital and earn dividends. Those are the people they hate for some reason. I don't know why, I don't know what the psychology of it is, I don't actually get it. So, this is what in Gone with the Wind, as he said, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn, and that is how the people who obsess about inequality feel about the poor. That brings me to the end of the presentation. I have said some stuff that, as I said, is shamelessly controversial and would happily take questions and debate and discussion, and you don't have to agree with me, but thanks for your attention. I didn't see anyone sleeping, which is what I was saying.
Thank you very much. That was certainly lived up to expectations, and judging by the expression on the audience, I'm sure we're going to have some very interesting questions. Who would like to go first? Would you mind saying your name?
My name is Tiger Vessels. Richard Wilkinson gives a presentation on one of the TED Talks where he maps inequality in countries, in states in the US against social ills. And there seems to be quite a strong correlation between the increase in social ills, prison populations, drug use, etc., in communities and in countries where the income or wealth difference, I don't quite know what the term is. I think it's a Gini coefficient, I'm not sure. But the two correlate fairly well. I don't know if you're familiar with that work of his, or if you are, whether you have a comment on it.
I'm not familiar with his work, but I have seen data on this, which is not to that effect. And one would have to compare the two and find out why the difference. There are statistics that show the opposite, published, for example, by the Fraser Institute in Vancouver, Canada, and by the Heartland Institute in Chicago, and by the Liberty Institute in India. Those are ones that come to mind, where I've seen them correlate crime rates, and I'm not sure what he means, social instability. And I'm always suspicious that, one has to drill down and say, what exactly does he mean? What index is he using? And if it's crime, what do you mean by crime? Do you mean technical crime, not having a license? Or do you mean violent crime? Or do you mean what's called property crime, stealing of stuff? So, often these things, I'm afraid to say, before you can make any sense of them, unfortunately, you have to become an intellectual detective and drill down and get to understand, as I've done with the inequality debate, many hours of research and analysis to get to where I can say the kinds of things I've said here. So I would have to do that with Wilkinson to be able to say whether he's right or wrong. And it is at variance with data I've seen, and I would be quite wrong to dismiss it because you have to look at it. Yes, please. You have to have a look at it in a dispassionate way. Yeah.
Just to follow on that, I mean, there's lies, Dan lies. Sorry, Guy Harris. There's lies, Dan lies, and statistics. But I think that there's a perception. I mean, I think, to my mind, one of the greatest drivers of inequality, however you want to define it, is education, and particularly the early childhood development. And I can remember many years ago reading those kids who hadn't had any preschool education ended up being having higher proportions of prison population, etc. Don't ask me to analyse what crimes they did to get there, but I imagine they were mainly property crimes rather than traffic infringements or anything like that. And I think that in the modern world, and you use the examples of how technology has changed, but even in the modern world, the first 1,000 days are so critically important. And it's the first 1,000 days from conception rather than from birth. And there's a lot of work that's being done by the Douglas Murray Trust in Cape Town around this, and some initiatives around that. I think that, to me, is the driver around inequality. And I think that my concern around a lot of the policy issues at the moment is trying to address inequality unsustainably through temporary redistribution rather than through addressing the real education and the ability to allow people to get a hand up rather than a handout. So the teach a person to fish rather than give them a fish type of situation.
Yes, there seems to be a lot to that. Personally, my own personal view, but I tried in this presentation to deal with the data, the statistics.
Yeah.
My own personal view is a human being's quality of life is a psychological condition. That you're not depressed, that you're happy, that you enjoy sunsets, you have good association with friends and acquaintances and so on. And my own view is that the amount of material assets you have is probably of surprisingly little importance. And so I consider myself, sorry Robert to pick on you, but I consider myself pretty much equal to Robert. And we're both happy and we both...
I don't lie.
Well, I'll pick on someone else. But no, it's just that I happen to know you can take it. But yes, I think education is important. Being intellectually confident and assertive, walking into a supermarket, knowing you can add up the numbers and work out what you're buying, being able to read the newspaper, a book, whatever it is. That seems to me to be an important factor in a person's equality level of life. So literacy rates rising, which is happening at quite an alarming rate around the world. It's really quite amazing. We've reached a stage, you're old enough to know there was a time when you would have assumed the majority of human beings around you were illiterate. You now assume the majority around you are literate. They can read a note you leave for the housekeeper when you go out or whatever. Now that's a hell of a change, you see. That's a massive change. And that type of equality is, in my view, the equality that really matters, is getting people to be intellectually competent and empowered and confident and assertive. And the number of rands they have in their bank account or in the stock market or whatever, in my view, actually has very little to do with equality. Yes, sir. Ooh. There.
And then some over here as well.
Brian Stalin.
Now don't lean towards the right.
Inequality is part of the natural order. You have the Pareto distribution occurs in many things in nature, in plant size, in grains of sand, and if you say that 20% of the people would have 80% of the wealth, fair enough, and if you take those 20% and Pareto principle applies to those 20%, who have 4%, having 65% of the wealth, and then you have 1% having 50% of the wealth. So it's quite normal that you have this distribution, nothing wrong with it. But the other thing about inequality is that it enables innovation to occur. Because if a poor person, or an average wealthy person, has a good idea which he can't afford to finance, to implement, unless he can go to a wealthier person to get the capital, you won't get innovation. So inequality is good.
No, I agree with that. What I would say, it lets somebody wonder why I didn't say much about inequality in South Africa. Let me say that firstly, the narrative in South Africa is the same. In other words, we just have the global narrative brought down to South Africa. But here it has a complex and sensitive racial dimension. And this bedevils any sensible discussion. It makes it very, very difficult. Because whatever anyone says, you're immediately supposed to be speaking from a white or a black or a male or a female perspective, so-called. So it's actually quite difficult. You see, he's going off to go and check his shares. Cheers, Robert. So yes, I agree with that. That it is these distributions mean very little. They're dynamic and fluid. People presume they're static. In other words, people at the top and the bottom are always there and have always been there and will stay there. That is absolutely not so. There's huge social mobility and income mobility and intellectual mobility and so on. And then in South Africa, there's a great deal of good news. I've written about it on a racial front, but it's not the time here to delve into it. But the degree to which black South Africans have taken advantage of their freedom since '94 is actually quite impressive and tends to be ignored. I'll give you one simple statistic. Over 50% of all property transactions in historically white areas, in other words, freehold titles, actual land being bought through estate agents and registered in the deeds registry, over half of the buyers are now black South Africans. Now, almost nobody mentions this. You go to the Department of Housing website, it's as if these people don't exist. The housing black people have is what the government gave them with RDP, and people who live in the locations and townships. So there's in South Africa a similar story to be told, but it's a difficult story to tell because it's so tied up with emotion and race that it requires a different event. Yeah, but I think it's a good story. I think the heroic accomplishments of black South Africans by themselves, not handouts, not welfare, not redistribution, is actually an insult, a racial insult that it's not acknowledged.
Your point that the wealth is not static, it's very evident in the fact that if you look at the enormous amount of wealth that's been created in the last 15 years, in fact in the last 6 years, if you just take Uber, which has a market cap of $60 billion, and that wealth never existed before 5 years ago, and that clearly that's got to cause a concentration of wealth.
Yes, and you know, the people who become these billionaires in their 20s and 30s, instead of us thanking them, we resent them. Well, not we. I mean, the inequality, what I call the inequality junkies and the wealth deniers, they are angry about the fact that somebody produces a new technology, a new innovation, Facebook or Twitter or whatever it might be. Instead of saying these are the heroes to whom we should be building monuments. These are the people for whom we should have monuments. These are the people who have contributed most to humanity of anybody. And I find it quite strange that they tend to be resented and decried and people want to pull them down instead of thanking them for lifting us up. Yes, achievement.
Yes, Leon, you have just partly covered on the comment that I wanted to make actually. But then I'm going to focus specifically about South Africa regarding inequality. And you having mentioned that we should be celebrating humanity's greatest achievement. Somehow, I think the government is doing that. They're just caught between both sides. Today, you will hear the president say, we have a good story to tell. And he will unpack exactly what you've just been saying in terms of South Africa having dealt with poverty and all these other things, the rising living standard. And then the following day, then you will hear him and the other policymakers saying a different story. I think they're just somehow a little bit schizophrenic as to, they don't know exactly. They just choose, I think, given on the event or the nature of the event as to who to please at that particular time, I just don't know. But somehow, I think they do know that we or the world, in South Africa in particular, have just done a lot in terms of human development.
Yes, I think achievement, that's, in my view, a profound insight. I'm puzzled by, if you take our president, in the State of the Nation address this year, it's a narrative about how wonderful things have been and how much has changed. And the presidency has published a thing called the 20-year review, which is produced by Statistical Stats SA. And it's full of the data, life expectancy, healthcare services. And if you read that, you think South Africa, the post-South Africa is an incredible accomplishment and miracle. In the previous year's State of the Nation address, the same president said, and I don't know who the speechwriters were, but it was presumably a different speechwriter, that little has changed, blacks have got nowhere, we need more, power redistribution, whatever. And there is a schizophrenia, and the schizophrenia is actually quite simple to understand. If you're in power, you want an excuse for more power, more patronage. On the other hand, you also want to say that you've been successful. On the one hand, you want to say things are a failure, therefore we need more power. On the other hand, you want to say we've done a good job. So this is why you get these completely opposing stories about how great everything is versus nothing has changed, things have got worse. The narrative that things have got worse or little has changed is quite a strange one. Because if you think about it, it carries with it a very bizarre implication, namely that apartheid did no harm. Get rid of it and things don't get better. You see, that's very odd. That would be very peculiar indeed. So the chances are things have got very substantially better. You can say not at a fast enough rate, or it's a very fast rate, or whatever. But to say that the rate of change, the slow rate of change, is one of the cliches, or nothing has changed, or whites still own everything, or these things, that would be very, very peculiar. I mean, if you get rid of a crime against humanity, one of the most racially, perhaps the most racially oppressive system in modern times, you liberate the victims of that. If they don't, if things aren't better for them, it's a very peculiar idea. So we must assume. But again, I knew you would lead me into this dangerous waters of South Africa's racial politics, but I think at least you and I agreed.
I think we're going to say maybe another 3 questions, and then after that, Leon is available over a glass of wine to talk more. And you're not rushing off, I take it?
I don't drink. I don't do any sins at all. I don't drink, smoke, use foul language, I eat salt, sugar. I'm Minister Motsoaledi's poster boy.
And he's terribly modest, as you can see.
And I'm modest.
Okay, I think maybe Hugh and then maybe start with this gentleman. Those 3, and then anyone else who would like to ask a question, please speak to Leon directly. Is that acceptable?
Did
Yes.
you recognise?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
One, 2,
Quick question.
3.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Leon, hello. My name is Ray Harroway. I work in executive pay. And I think what's feeding the frenzy for these junkies is the perception that CEO pay is not earned. But if I read your presentation, you say, well, I don't care what they earn.
Yes.
But where?
No, because my view is very simple. The people who pay them have to decide that's what they want to pay. The CEOs don't pay themselves. You see, there's a kind of view that somehow if you're a CEO, you enrich yourself, and somehow at the expense of others.
Some of them do.
Well, maybe some do, but certainly, typically CEOs have a committee that does. And the shareholders. If the public investment corporation and the pension funds and the medical schemes and the institutions which actually own and control almost every...
You include ESCOM, don't you?
Well, I do include ESCOM, yes. If the people who make the decision decide to pay the CEO a lot, who am I to say it's too much or too little? I don't have a view on the matter. I assume the people who make that decision have a reason to, and I offer my services if you're in that field. Please let it be known that I'm available to be a CEO at half the price. I'll give them a bulk discount. I'll do 20 companies. So no, it's actually, let me just be crude about this. It's nonsense. What CEOs get paid is decided by the people who pay them with their own money, and it's none of our business, to put it bluntly. Yeah. Yes.
Leon, in what way do the inequality junkies propose addressing their perceived problem?
Oh, this is the agenda. The agenda is massively increased power, massively increased status. They are on the bandwagon of being beneficiaries from what they have in mind. They want to seize and nationalize literally a fixed percentage, 5% or so, of all global capital every single year into governments of the world and the United Nations, which they then will run. So I think it is a very selfish, self-serving
a redistribution agenda for their own selfish
for themselves. They are not interested in redistributing to the poor at all.
Yeah.
And let me just give you, if I can use a South African example here, what we call redistribution, say, of white commercial farmland. None of it is ever redistributed. Not one single black person has ever received one of those farms. On the contrary, they then belong to the people in the Department of Land Affairs, or what I call the Department of Land Despair. And black people are put on the land as tenants, not owners. Black people in Alex are, well, we agreed on Saturday, as you were told, as a result of our work, that they would all get their title deeds and other areas. But nonetheless, these people who want to redistribute don't redistribute at all. They seize the capital, they control it, and like Verwoerd, we are now putting black people as tenants on government-owned land, not as owners of land. And that's the reality.
Vote for us and we'll extend your tenancy.
Yeah.
Bjorn, just leading on from that, if I may, Jane, one can immediately in that answer see that scenario evolving here in South Africa. Assuming the ANC win the next general election, then doing exactly that, using this inequality thing to redistribute wealth. And that leads on to another thing. Are you alone in your voice against the inequality junkies, or is there a bigger movement than just Leon Louw?
There's the embryonic movement. It's starting. My view is this is the new ideological frontier of the world. There's no longer a debate about systems, ideologies. And more people are beginning to realize it and respond to it. If you just do an internet search, you'll see that there's a huge amount of scholarship. Deidre McGlosky, for example, is an eminent econometrician at Chicago University who's produced a lot of work on this, explaining how wealth works and why the inequality junkies are wrong. And I would recommend everybody to her. Interestingly, she used to be Donald McCloskey and is now so she's now Deidre. So literally, if you look up the works of Donald and Deidre, there was a man who's now a woman, and this is really some very excellent scholarship.
Jane, just without wishing to patronise Leon, I thought tonight was brilliant, and I think there's a crying need at this point in time in this country's history for something like this presentation somehow to be got out there where people can see through this. I think there was a voice recording and a camera, and maybe that's the basis of some mass distribution. I'll leave that with you.
Right, the last one.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Okay, I just wanted to, I broadly agree, that we should, with your presentation. However, I'm just sort of thinking like some of the things that people who are on the inequality bandwagon, if they look at, say, something like crime, for instance, they might argue, well, that's because of inequality and that people want what the better man has, and therefore there's a social problem with that. But what I wanted to say is, I think you could look at that differently, because what it seems to me, especially if you look at South Africa, is that aspirations of people who are poor are being dampened and limited. So there's examples of people wanting to better themselves. And this morning on 702, whatever, they were talking about the number of entrepreneurs has actually dropped, or businesses have closed, and the challenges small businesses have to face to stay afloat. So what you've got is people wanting to better themselves, and at the same time there's a lot of stuff that's being put in their way. So I think we could challenge that side of the social argument that inequality people might want to bring in. Say that people want more, and that's why crime. But crime isn't the natural way to go necessarily.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. The thing about crime that's interesting is property crime, which I did research many years ago. The majority of property crimes were actually not performed, meaning things like burglaries and carjackings and so on, not actually performed by what you would call brickwork. They tended to be syndicates and tended to be quite sophisticated people. I suppose a mugging in an alleyway might well be a very poor person or impoverished person. But interestingly, the people with whom I work a lot, we work a lot, the street vendors, the peasant farmers and so on, in my view, I can't cite a source for this statement, but certainly my very strong impression is are not great criminals. These are not the people committing the crimes. And I'm very worried about an assumption that poor people are likely to be criminals. That doesn't mean I don't want to raise their living standards. And what you say is absolutely right. Get rid of the obstacles, help them get ahead. I think I heard that program where they were talking about they need support. It was the professor from Wits who you were listening to, yes. And he's the Johannesburg development academic. And yes, and what I was thinking while I was listening to that program is the type of obstacle that I would want addressed, and I'll just give you one small example. I'm going to give you two quickly, and then we'll close. Firstly, the financial sector. When the Financial Intermediary and Advisory Services Act was a bill before Parliament, a strong representation was made by the Black Brokers Association, which had a few thousand members, that if it was passed there would be carnage amongst emerging brokers. It was passed. There is no longer such a thing as the Black Brokers Association. The Financial Services Board boasted to Parliament last year that it had deregistered 15,000 independent brokers. It was proud of that fact. I've been asking people in insurance if there are any of this in this room. You can please let me know. And I've asked people like Adrian Gore and others, people across the way as Prime Meridian, do you know of any black brokers in South Africa? They think and they say no. And I say, but there used to be a strong emerging organization and a business sector. And then I say, well, do you know any white brokers? Maybe a few, but they virtually disappeared. So what has happened is, because of the financial services regulation, of which the Financial Services Board is proud, an entire emerging sector of service providers has been destroyed and vanished and wiped out. Now, what color do you think most of them were? What color do you think their customers were, who now no longer get financial services? And the other one I want to mention is this very popular Consumer Protection Act. Just consider this simple fact. It requires that everyone has to have a cooling off period of 10 days or whatever it is. Okay? So that means you have to be sophisticated enough to keep records of who bought what, to be able to take the products back, to repackage them, to put them back on the shelf, etc., etc., etc. Now, a spaza shop, a tuck shop, a small independent grocery store somewhere, a clothing store in Pofadder, or Vergenoeg, or Winterveld, or Aansluit, could they comply with just one provision in the Consumer Protection Act? The chances are no. So they either just operate unlawfully. But to take us another one, you used to be able to sell things footstoots. So a country trader used to sell ploughs and tractors and stoves and pumps and what have you, footstoots. Now the law says it has to come with a fully fledged warranty and guarantee. Now, just imagine that. You used to be able to buy an old skedonk, a bakkie, for 10,000 rand if you're a peasant farmer in the Matatayal district. Now, you may not buy this 10,000 rand skedonk anymore and take your own chances with it. You now have to buy, if you're a consumer, a fully fledged guarantee, which will cost 60 to 70 to 100,000 rand. In other words, you have raised the price of products for the poor. Entrepreneurs wanting to do pumping or buy a fridge or whatever it might be, by 5, 6, 10, 20-fold. You've priced them out of the market completely by something that parades itself as consumer protection. You are now forced to pay more to get a cooling off period you may not want, to get a guarantee or a warranty you may not want, and so on. So I'm just mentioning examples. With that, we'll come to an end, and I just want to say that we've taken a goodly amount of time, and I remember the guy was speaking to the Rotary Club, and the Rotary Club has a president who sits there with the gong. They meet once a week at lunchtime, and the president sits with a gong and a gavel. Some of you might be Rotarian, you'll see heads nodding. And when the speaker goes over his time, the president strikes the gong to attract attention, or time is up. And there was this one speaker who just went on and on. The
gong is going, Leon.
Yes, the president struck the gong, and he carried on, and the president struck again. And eventually the president took a big swipe at the gong and hit the fellow on the head next to him by mistake. And as he slid away under the table, you heard the voice coming up saying, "Please hit me again, I can still hear him."
They've got your reputation for being controversial and thought-provoking and very amusing. Thank you all very much for coming, for your attention and your very interesting questions. If you'd like a glass of wine and something to eat, please stay. Liam will be here to talk more. And thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you again.